Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Today is an exciting day because we are coming up with a very exciting series called AI Core Talks, an in depth, comprehensive, yet pacey conversation and engaging talk session in a whole new format with proven AI analytic leaders. With discussions, we'll be talking about best practices, trends in the global AI analytics arena. We'll be talking about deep dive sessions uh, and discussions around pivotal topics around core AI topics, whether it's around novel innovations, transformations, adoption, implementation approaches. So 3i is India's largest platform for AI analytics leaders, professional and aspirants. We have conceptualized, executed path-breaking events earlier, whether it's summits, conferences, with different innovative formats. Uh, that has specifically led to fostering premier thought leadership advocacy and bringing out next in class themes and topics in AI analytics relevant to 3i members and the external ecosystem. Through our bespoke, differentiated, and curated eight large scale event formats earlier already completed, AIism being the recent one, and then U3 Storm, to name a few. Our 550 plus AI analytic thought leaders and influencers at 3i have shared immense nuggets of topical knowledge and insights with our 17,000 plus members from working professionals, aspirants, and student communities. Over the previous years, 3i has executed 250 plus external engagements and interventions, whether it's the knowledge insight sessions, the large scale events, the leadership roundtable sessions, expert talks, masterclass series. And now, as I mentioned, we bring in AI core talks, an in depth, comprehensive, yet conversation on engaging topics around AI analytics and more in a talk format. Today's topic, this is the first session which we are having now as we kickstart our journey into AI Core Talks. Today's topic is very interesting. Uh, we will be talking about how, when we talk about the overall value driven frameworks for AI initiatives, what does it look like? How does the journey look like? As we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about the adoption around that. Uh, the journey around adoption continues to grow at a steady pace. Implementing AI into business requires an element of whether we call R&D, experimentation, understanding that's not very uh, going to kind of drive the ROI. And AI is a key enabler, you already know, in terms of defining new business models to drive business value across organizations. But the biggest challenges many organizations still face how is to how to maximize the business value from AI initiatives. And specifically to talk about this, go a little deep into this topic, we have an experienced thought leader of 3i, uh, Vijay Morampudi. He's the director of and head of artificial intelligence. And where what he's doing right now is he's specifically responsible for driving business initiatives for clients in healthcare, bio, pharma, agriculture, manufacturing, retail, and banking verticals, to name a few. And he has also successfully built and launched a commercially successful end-to-end AI framework with an open source stack to accelerate the journey to experiment and launch AI models. Um, it's my immense pleasure to bring in Vijay to this talk first and specifically talk about this topical topic. So, Vijay, over to you. I, as well as the audience, are really looking forward to your thoughts on specifically the area of value-driven frameworks from an AI analytics perspective, and what does it really mean in terms of traversing the journey there.
Thanks, Kapil, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. Okay, so as Kapil mentioned, today we are going to look at how can we maximize value from AI initiatives. Before we get into the topic, let's have a quick look at numbers, right? When you look at ROI, leaders have achieved an ROI of 5% for their AI initiatives. At the same time, the other people, they are only able to achieve a negligible value, in some cases, a negative ROI from the AI initiatives. Let's look at payback period. Leaders are able to achieve a typical payback period of 1.2 years. At the same time, beginners are taking around 1.6 years for achieving the payback period. So the trend clearly shows experience and maturity plays a big role in achieving the value. I want to tell you a story here. It sounds like this. An enterprise started their journey with 3 to 5 small team members. They worked on initial use cases and demonstrated a business value of $1 million. Now, they want to scale their team to 5 to 10x, hoping that they want to achieve a 5 to $10 billion in revenue. But when you look at the reality is like this, they are not able to achieve the desired value. Scaling has its own challenges in terms of collaboration, managing data, and managing models. In the next slide, we are going to look at ways to maximize the value. I want to talk about value-driven framework. It is broadly categorized into 4 different phases. Each phase includes best practices to maximize the value. Value discovery. It focuses on identifying the right problems to solve, how to prioritize them, and define a roadmap for implementation. Value driven development. It focuses on how to build a portfolio to launch AI initiatives. Value delivery. It focuses on delivering the value incrementally. Value realization. It focuses on how to measure the ROI for AI initiatives. It is an iterative process and a continuous process. Let's look at the drivers of value. So it's a combination of all these. It starts with identifying the right problems to solve. You need to use right techniques to achieve the value. In AI, you have multiple technologies to solve the problem. For applied AI, you need to solve the problem with a simple technique. Finally, the people aspect. You need to have a cross-functional team. It includes end users, domain experts, business translators. They are the people who can help you in translating business problems into AI tasks, and the development team. You also need to consider how your AI team is organized. You also need to build a culture of experimentation to drive value. We look at each of them in detail in next slides. Value discovery. I want to talk a little bit about design thinking. So this is a powerful concept which is there for more than 50 years. As you can see here, organizations who are using design thinking, they are achieving high returns for AI initiatives. I want to talk about its relevance for AI initiatives. So one of the core concept of design thinking is empathy. What we know is user empathy. It mainly focuses on understanding the user pain points, and also it helps you to understand how a task comes performed currently and what is the kind of level of performance that is achieved. You also need to understand what kind of explainability is required for a user to use a solution. I want to add two more dimensions to the empathy. One of them is domain empathy. We generally hear that in AI, garbage in, garbage out, right? To overcome this challenge, you need to have a better understanding of the domain to identify the right heuristics or inputs required to solve the problem. At the same time, you need to have a empathy towards technology. The goal of AI is to solve problems, not to use technology, right? Focus on simple solution to solve a problem. Another important aspect of design thinking is feasibility determination. For that solution to be usable, it is required to understand what kind of change is required for the solution to be adopted successfully. And also you need to understand does your solution requires a kind of regulatory compliance. Next, you need to look at the technical feasibility. Do you have enough data to solve the problem? And also you need to understand what kind of error rate is acceptable for your domain. Finally, you need to think of is it commercially viable to build a solution? Having understood design thinking, let's look at how to identify the AI solutions. Sorry, AI initiatives. You need to monitor the products, business processes, services, and also look at the industry. And then you need to apply design thinking concept to identify the right problems to be solved. For business problems, you need to identify the root causes and prioritize them. Similarly, for the opportunities, look at the enablers and prioritize them. Then you need to understand how AI will bring unique value to the problems that you are solving. All the initiatives that you identified needs to be evaluated through the feasibility framework, and the initiatives which clear the feasibility criteria are added to the roadmap. Another important question that you need to understand is that how to build a roadmap. So I want to differentiate roadmap building from for brownfields domains and the greenfield domains. What do I mean by brownfield domains? These are the domains where you have proven solutions that are available in the industry, and somebody in the industry is already applying these solutions and they are very successful commercially. Let's look at how do you define a roadmap for brownfield domains. So here the goal is to you need to do 20% of the work quickly and achieve 80% of the return. So in case if you don't have a data, you build your solution using rule-based approach and you quickly launch your solution to gather the enough data. Later, once you have enough data, you build an AI solution which will help you to optimize the performance. And then finally, you use a custom solution which will help you to cover the long tail scenarios in a business. Now let's look at how do you build a roadmap for the greenfield domains. So in greenfield domains, one important thing that you need to understand is that there are no proven solutions available in the industry. It's still in the research phase. That's what I mean by greenfield. Now let's understand how to build a roadmap for the greenfield domains. Here, the goal is to reduce the risk initially. How do you do that? You build a POC to understand how to apply a technology to the specific domain. And then once you are successful with the POC, you take a business scenario and you launch a pilot project. Having looked at the success of the pilot projects, you will extend your solution to cover the other business scenarios as well. So once you define the roadmap, next the important thing that you need to consider is how do you frame the problem correctly to maximize the business value. Let me tell you with an use case, right? Here, a particular company has a business objective of reducing the churn. What are the possible ways in which they can frame this problem statement? So, if you are asking a descriptive question, your goal is to understand how many customers are we losing and who are they. It gives you minimum business value. Instead of that, if you are framing a predictive question like, can I know in advance who are those customers, those are leaving in a certain specific period of time? Here you can able to maximize the business value. In prescriptive scenario, knowing that who are the customers leaving, what retention policies should I apply to retain them? If you achieve this, this is where you gain the maximum business value. As you look at this diagram, here when you are framing the question, don't frame question in such a way that you need to build a predictive maintenance model. Instead of that, you need to ask right questions. The first question that you can ask is that how do we detect a parts failure in an operational data? Right? Once you understood this, how can you do this? The next step is to build a predictive model which will help you to predict the parts failure. Once you build this solution, the next step is that knowing that what is the part that is going to fail, what actions are you going to take to replace the part. This is how you are going to maximize the business value. You also need to understand decision intelligence. I will tell you the reason why I am talking about it. Here you can see 65% of the decisions that were made by the businesses are complex than 2 years ago. And also, as you can see, there is a high collaboration between machines and humans working together. In this situation, how do you maximize the value? So let's look at two different dimensions. Who is making a decision? Whether it's a human making a decision or a machine is going to making a decision. The first part of it is decision support systems. Here, system will help you in generating a prediction. Human will review and here they will make a decision. The next part is that decision augmentation system. There are multiple ways of how a decision augmentation system works. Either a machine suggests, human decides. In other scenarios, human suggests and machine decides. It's essentially humans and machines working together to make a decision. In decision automation scenario, this is where decision is automated and where machines are making a prediction. You still have human in the loop to handle the exceptional scenarios. Also understand it's not necessary that you need to automate every decision. I will tell you with an example why. So let's look at a diagnosing the cancer use case. Here, you are building a system to diagnose the cancer. The input that you are providing to the system is that a CT scan of a patient, which will provide the current health status of a patient. You build a prediction model, which will help you identify the tumors and understand which of the tumors are going to be malignant. And your system, if it detects tumors in the scan, it alerts the doctors, and the doctors will review the process. And finally, it is the doctor who is going to make a decision. The decision here is that having understood the patient has a cancer, what is the optimal treatment that he can recommend for a patient so that he can recover fully. Here, as you see, decision is made by the human and system is augmenting the doctor in making a right decision and saving a lot of valuable time so that doctors can focus more on treating the patients rather than evaluating the reports. Having understood how to identify the value, once you identify the value, the next step is that to do the development to achieve the value. One of the best practices that is recommended is that when you are launching AI initiatives, it is important to build an AI portfolio. Why do you need AI portfolio? It basically aligns your AI strategy with your organizational strategy. As many of you know, that starting an AI initiative requires initial startup funding. A portfolio will help you to fund the initiatives. At the same time, there is a less probability that every initiative is successful. Instead of measuring the ROI at an initiative level, it is always good to measure the ROI at a portfolio level. This is a well-proved approach that is used by the drug-driven companies, drug development companies. While building a portfolio, you need to ensure that you have a mix of initiatives. Ensure that you have a good amount of quick wins, which will help you to maximize the margins. At the same time, try to include some strategic initiatives which will help you to improve the overall revenue. Finally, we all know that AI requires an element of innovation, right? Elements include some of the initiatives which will help you to do innovation so that you will be ahead of the competition. Another important aspect of a portfolio is that when you are working on a AI transformation journey, it requires an organizational change. Your portfolio will help you to transition our organization into the new execution model. And finally, many of the AI initiatives will have a dependencies across them. So your portfolio will help you to manage those dependencies either in terms of data synergies or model synergies so that you can maximize the revenue, and also it will help you to get a buy-in from the stakeholders to initiate the new use cases. At the same time, you also need to explore the synergies across the use cases. Before starting the development, it is important to understand the success criteria for the AI initiatives. You need to understand what is the success criteria, what kind of performance is required. Is it industry average, best in class, or you are just it is good to achieve the general performance initially. Once you understood the success criteria, you also need to understand what is the failure criteria, in what scenarios your solution is not usable. This will help you to understand when can you transfer decision making from a system to a human. At the same time, you also need to understand what are the constraints in building a solution. It will help you to identify the right algorithm to build a solution. Also, it is important for the development team to understand what are the business KPIs that are required and how their solution is going to help them to achieve the business KPI. It also translates into what kind of model metrics are required to measure the model performance. Let's look at an example. In this case, I'm going to talk about MRI image enhancement. If you look at the business hypothesis, it says accelerating MRI by a fewer measurements will help you to reduce medical costs, at the same time minimize stress to the patients. What is going to be the business KPI here? It's revenue. If you look at the standard MRI protocol, it will help you to scan some certain number of patients. If we are developing a solution which will accelerate the scan process, you can scan additional patients in a day. So it will indirectly help you to gain more revenue. So to achieve that revenue, now what kind of acceleration is required? If you go with 4x acceleration, you achieve certain amount of value. Is it possible to achieve 6x and 8x? This is the question that development team has to think about. Is it possible for us to achieve this kind of acceleration with the known solution at this point of time. Once you understood the business matrices, the next important thing is that what are the relevant model metrics that you need to keep track of. In this particular scenario, we have both quantitative and qualitative matrices. If you look at the quantitative matrices, for this MRI image enhancement, PSNR, peak signal to noise ratio, and the structural similarity metrics are the two quantitative metrics that are required for you to achieve the model performance. At the same time, these kind of solutions require an FDA approval. So you also need to understand, is the solution that you are building of good diagnostic quality that is required by the radiologist. So they use a Likert scale of 1 to 5 rating. You need to ensure that whether your accelerated scan is meeting the qualitative measurement criteria also before taking for an approval. Having understood the kind of performance requirement, two important challenges that the development team faces is that, is it possible to achieve the level of performance that is required? And the second challenge that they face is that, what is the timeline required to achieve the performance? Let me tell you some of the ways to mitigate these problems. So once you understood the kind of performance requirement, do some exploration and see, is it an industry average performance? Are they looking at best in class or industry leading performance? Look at some of the state of the art models and see what kind of performance they are claiming. Here I have given a sample to understand the kind of matrices that you can achieve for different AI tasks. It will help you to understand how complex the problem is. Once you understood the complexity of the problem, the next step is to identify the duration required. So when you are defining the duration for a project, there are four different elements that you need to keep in mind. One, how complex is the domain that you are working upon? So if you are working in a medical imaging domain, you need to understand how radiology reports works, how a radiologist works. And also you need to understand data quality. Before data quality, you also need to understand, is there a data available? Especially when we are building a MRI image enhancement scan, low resolution scans are typically not available in the public domain. You need to approach the specific radiologist to get those kind of low quality scans. So that is like an input for our solution. At the same time, you also need to understand the technical expertise of your team. So if they are going to work on an advanced algorithm, it requires a lot of exploration and research. It requires considerable amount of time. And also you need to understand the solution complexity. Once you understood all these factors, then you need to create rather than creating a deterministic planning, you do a probabilistic planning. Also understand, ML progress is not linear, it is a non-linear. So if we achieve a 90% of performance, to achieve 92% performance, sometimes it takes double the time that is required from 0 to 92, 92, 92%. So it's very common that many times that your AI teams will not be able to showcase a progress for multiple weeks. Let's look at this with an example. So in this scenario, we are looking at a fraud detection. So here the business hypothesis is that a financial institute wants to build a fraud detection model so that they can save $150 million a year. Having understood the problem, your data science team explored the solution approaches and they found three different ways to solve the problem. And out of which, two are well-solved approach and one is a novel approach. If you look at them, based on the research, they figured out the desired level of performance that can be achieved by the well-solved problem is, it might be 70% if you are using a simpler trees, or it can achieve up to 95% if you are going with a deep learning approach. And if you are going to try with a novel approach, like using graphs, there you have the probability of achieving 99% performance. Now, having understood this, how do you define the schedule for this kind of solution? In the first scenario, if your business supports you to launch a solution with 70% performance, you can definitely build the solution. You can go with high confidence and you can able to build a solution and launch the product. In case if the 70% is not feasible, in that case you need to go with the deep learning approach where the team is only 75% confident to achieve the to complete the project on time. So you need to account for the remaining uncertainty. You need to include the additional buffer to account for the uncertainty of the team. In the third scenario, where your team is going to take a novel approach, so here there is a lot of uncertainty. Your team might have never worked in this area, and it's a new approach in the industry. It's still in the research phase. You need to customize the solution for your use case. So the team is very low confident in achieving this solution on time. So you need to consider that, and you need to include additional effort to achieve the solution. So this is the way how you need to do the estimation for your AI solutions. Also look at the structure of AI solution development. It's not like linear path like the way that you have seen here. It's not like a waterfall, right? You will start with discovery and then you understand the patterns in the data and you generate the features that are required for your model. Then you subsequently build the model and finally you deploy the solution. Typically, it doesn't look like this. This is the way that how it looks like. So you understand the problem and you explore for the solution approaches. As I mentioned earlier, you will identify 3 to 5 different approaches to solve the problem, out of which you prioritize few of them to experiment, and then you need to perform different kind of tuning the solution to achieve the better results. And finally, you also do A/B testing to try out which of the approach is working better.
Hi, Vijay. Great set of perspectives coming in. Just want to mention you have 10 minutes to complete this.
Sure. Okay. While when you understood that the AI solution is not a linear development, let's try to include the decision milestones in our plan to make the course correction. Also look at the solution complexity. As I have told you that when you are working on a AI problem, you need to understand what kind of complexity that is required for the solution. If you are going with a simpler approach, rule-based approach, it is less complex. If you are going with an ML approach, it is a little complex than the simpler approach. And finally, if you want to try with a novel approach, it is more complex than all, right? So moving towards the right, it increases the solution complexity, it requires more time to develop, and also it requires more effort to maintain the solution. So you need to make a right trade-off in terms of is the complexity justifiable for the gain in business value? If so, then only go with the higher complex solution. Otherwise, the best suggestion is always that go with a less complex solution. How do you do the development? You need to go with an experiment-driven approach. In an experiment-driven approach, you build the hypothesis and then you identify the actions that are required to perform an experiment, and finally you also need to define the criteria to evaluate an experiment. One important aspect that you need to understand is that when you are doing an experiment, if an experiment is successful and if you are able to achieve the desired performance, it's well and good. There is no experiment which is a failure. It's basically a learning from the experiment that you take it forward for the newer experiments. Now let's look at the value-driven value delivery. So how do you deliver the AI solution in an incremental fashion? Let's look at the financial fraud detection use case that we have seen earlier. So it's not like you do the feature engineering, model development, and deployment. The way you develop the solution is that you build a simple solution, you deploy it, and then you improve the solution using some advanced techniques. And finally, you can still use a novel techniques like a graph techniques where you can also understand the relationship between different entities and then feed them as inputs to your solution so that you can detect the frauds in a better way. When you are deploying a solution, you build a solution and you have a candidate model in place. The important thing that you need to ask is that how is your new solution comparing with the baseline solution? So in both these scenarios, your candidate model is performing as equivalent as the baseline model. In this scenario, it is performing better than the baseline model, which is really a good thing. But this is the challenging situation. Your candidate model is not performing as expected by the baseline model. So you need to understand why your model is failing in those scenarios. Another important aspect that you need to understand is that How significant is the gain in performance? Right? Is the gain in performance comes at a cost of drop in performance from some scenarios, as you have seen here? If so, evaluate those scenarios and ensure that your model is performing equally well for all scenarios. Also, look at the model errors. Your model is giving the output and it's highly confident. Good. And in these two scenarios, in one scenario, the model output is correct, and other scenario, the model output is incorrect. But your model is low confident in both the scenarios. These are the predictions that you can route to the human for manual evaluation, and then you can use active learning approach to improve the solution over a period of time. This is where the complexity comes in. Your model so output is incorrect, but it's high confident that it is correct. So in one of the scenario, what we did is that we applied model assertions to identify these high confidence errors. So if you look at this problem, um, it's a classifying the atrial fibrillation, which is basically a kind of heart problem. So in this scenario, as per the medical terminology, it says it should not change states, two different states in less than 30 seconds. So this is how we are able to define an assertion, which will identify whether this is happening in less than 30 seconds or more than 30 seconds. This is how you are able to catch the high confidence incorrect results. Another important thing that you need to consider from a technical development perspective is that how do you manage the debt? As you can see here, organizations who are managing the debt well, they are able to achieve 10% higher revenue than the average performers. And also you can see when they are allocating the budget, if they don't take care of the technical debt properly, they have to spend 20 to 40% of their money in just cleaning of the technical debt. It doesn't mean that technical debt is not bad. There are situations where you need to, where speed is the focus, like if you are exploring and if you are doing the research activities, and if you want to build a solution which will help you to secure the funding quickly. Also, if you are going for a regulatory compliance, ensure that your solution is working before you make it perfect. And then if you have any trade show plan, in these scenarios, speed is high priority than quality. So you need to make a trade-off between how to pay off the technical debt and when to speed up the development. So this we have already seen. When you are going with the scaling challenges, you have challenges in terms of managing data, experiments, pipelines, and models. So the best practice that you can follow is that you need to identify the right tools to manage your data, like data versioning and tracking the experiments, model versioning, and this is how you need to be able to scale the team well for multiple use cases. The last step in the value driven framework is the value realization. So when you measure the ROI, you measure by benefits by investments. So I will talk about some of the mistakes that people are doing in terms of calculating the ROI for AI projects. The first thing is that we all know that AI is not 100% correct. You need to account for the mistakes that our model is making, right, while calculating the ROI. And the second scenario is that your model performance will not do at the same level throughout the time. It degrades in performance over a period of time. You need to measure your ROI continuous basis. And the third thing is that don't measure the ROI at an individual project level, measure it at a portfolio level. Another important aspect that I want to touch upon is that when you are building the teams, there are different ways in which AI teams can be formed. Either it's a centralized or decentralized approach. Initially, when you are starting with an AI institute, it's always good to go with a centralized approach where there is a high focus in driving the value. Over a period of time, when your organization achieves a level of good maturity, then you can diffuse the teams into the projects. Another important measure that I want to talk about in measuring the performance of AI teams. So when you are measuring the performance in a short term, you look at how well they are executing out what they're trying out. But in the long term, you look at how many things are successful in what they tried out. The second aspect that you need to think about is that don't compare whose ideas worked and whose ideas didn't work. It's more of an exploratory activity. You need to focus upon the and the defining the right framework for measuring the different approaches, and you need to document them why we need to get certain decision. Also, another important decision that you need to focus on is that when you are appraising a team member, focus on the action what they have done. rather than the person, so that it will reinforce a positive behavior in the team. So in summary, I just want to reiterate on this one. If you want to optimize the value, you need to identify the right use cases, apply right techniques, and then choose the right technology to solve the problem, and ensure that you have a right team and you are growing a good culture to perform the experiments and drive the value. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay, for the insightful session. Great set of perspectives coming in whenever we talk about, and I took some notes also. Uh, when we talk about the value-driven frameworks from an AI perspective, you talked about the four, I would say, pillars of that, which is the value discovery, value-driven development, the value realization, and then specifically the value delivery. And under each, you went into detail. I would say you deep dived into whether it's around the value discovery, the design thinking aspects, identifying the AI initiatives, or it's around the minimum viable product roadmap for brownfield as well as greenfield domains. There was also a coverage around the overall AI portfolio. What are the success criteria for AI initiatives when we talk about the section value driven development? We talked about the challenges. We talked about the solution development. You talked about the solution complexity which comes around it. Fantastic set of use cases from a healthcare perspective, which you talked about. Uh, and then we've slowly moved into the other section around value delivery, bringing in the incremental delivery and uh, uh, the model error challenges, and how do we manage that, what we call the technical depth, depth around it. And then what do we do to scale those challenges, right? When it comes in, what are the challenges which come in when in terms of scaling? You want to scale in further. What are those challenges and how to go about it? And then the last aspect, when you talked about the overall value realization, how do we look into the ROI and the payback period? And this is an extremely important aspect which comes in for any specific initiative which you are doing. Whether you talk about the AI aspects or you talk about any project also, right? There is always this ROI and payback period which will come in, and from a business perspective, this question is something which will come in as part of it. And then how do we kind of organize the teams? What does that AI team organization look like? But also, how do we measure their performance? So what do we do in terms of the AI team measurements, and what are the things which we need to talk about there? So very, I would say you covered the 360-degree aspects very beautifully in terms of bringing each aspect, talking about it, going deep dive into it, and then specifically coming up the last section, which was the summary, summarizing the session very beautifully. So Vijay, thank you so much for being part of this and helping us kind of shape the what we call AI Core Talk series. This is the first of the series, as I talked about to all the audience, which we have started on core topical topics, very deep dived, focused, fast and pacey. We want to keep it in that way. And as you talked about and actually helped us traverse through the value driven frameworks for area initiatives, it was a very interesting and a great journey for me. I'm sure for the audience it would have been similar. And I thank you as well as the audience for being part of it and helping us being there. Thank you, Vijay, again for this wonderful session.
Thanks, Kapil, and thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
all.